Yo! Welcome back to the channel. Now, in my last video, I was talking about, does Dana gotta go? Is it time for Dana White to retire, step down as the president of the UFC, and let someone else run the show? Because lately, he has been saying some stuff that has been rubbing people the wrong way, and he's been going on a ton of rants. Now, since that video, we have actually unlocked a new rant from Dana himself. And this rant has nothing to do with the UFC at all. And that is the boxing rant. So, my question today is, does Dana White want to ruin boxing, and should Conor McGregor sign up? Now, when I posted that video asking, is it time for Dana White to retire? Never in a million years did I think that he would not only not retire, but decide to move into a totally different sport altogether. Now, that should just tell you the type of person that we're dealing with Dana White. Now, Dana White has been in the UFC for probably over 20, probably over 30 years, right? And you would think someone that's been doing something for that long, that is as rich as he is and as successful as he is, would realize that he has a great life and it might be time to go do something else. Go enjoy your life with your family. Go on a vacation. Something like that. But what does Dana White do? He tells everyone that he wants to get into boxing. Now, I have no clue what Dana White is thinking of. He says that he has a plan for this, yet in his last press conference that he did, you had reporters asking him simple questions, and it didn't seem like Dana White knew what to say. All he said was, "We have a plan, and we'll let you know once that plan is ready." I thought you already had a plan, Dana. So when people ask you, hey, do you plan to work with people outside of the UFC? And he's like, well, we have a plan. Well, buddy, that's why we're asking. We want to know what the plan is. So if you think that Dana White is going into boxing for any other reason than the money, you're crazy. This is all one big money grab. Now, I don't know how this is going to work out, because someone like Dana White is used to running the show. They control everything, and they don't really, for the most part, have to deal with any outside people, any outside voices, or anything like that. Dana White sets the rules. Dana White plays by his own rules. Now, we know boxing is totally different, and boxing has been around way longer than the UFC has ever existed. There's a certain way that they do things in boxing that I don't think Dana White is going to adapt well to. For one, Dana White is not going to be able to control the whole show. Now, with the UFC, all the fighters are signed to Dana White. They're signed under the UFC. So you don't have to go out, work with other promoters, work with other fighters that you're unfamiliar with, try to negotiate terms and things like that. With boxing, we know there's a ton of Dana Whites. There's not one Dana White. You have many promoters in the boxing space, and We know Dana White has a huge ego. He doesn't like to play by anybody else's rules. He likes to do things his way or the highway. And if you're not down with doing it his way, he's kicking you off the roster. Now, we know that in boxing, it's much different. It takes two to tango in boxing. Now, sometimes you might have a rare occasion where, you know, it's not that hard, but usually you need two to tango. So what is Dana White going to do when he has to work with the promoter that he doesn't necessarily like, that he doesn't see eye to eye with? Because in his last press conference, he said, yeah, he's willing to work with some of the promoters. And then he also said there's certain promoters that he will not work with at all, and that we should know who those promoters are. And I'm like, Dana White, you have to put your pride to the side. You have to put your ego to the side. Because unlike UFC, where you could just make the fights happen, in boxing, there might be a fighter that you want to work with, but he's signed to a different promoter. And nothing's going to get done unless you can work with that promoter and co-promote the fight. So let's say there's a fight that the fans want to see, and there's a promoter that Dana White doesn't like. How is that fight ever going to get done? And how is that going to make the fighter feel when all they want to do is just fight? They want to have this opportunity of a lifetime, and they can't even get the fight because Dana White has issues with the person representing them. Now, UFC, I guess you could say it's a monopoly, but with boxing, you have to be able to come to terms and to come to agreements with people, even if you don't like them. And we know that all boxing promoters, they don't get along. It's not like it's like one big happy family. But the thing is, they still find a way to make the fights happen. Now, in boxing, you have some promoters like Bob Arum, Eddie Hern, even some new promoters. You got Floyd Mayweather has a promotion company. Canelo might have a promotion company, and there might be fighters under them that are signed to them or that they might be managing. And that's great. I'm sure Dana White wouldn't have a problem making a fight with somebody on Mayweather's team. I'm sure he wouldn't have a problem working with Eddie Hern. But let's say that there's a good fight to be made, an up-and-coming fighter, a prospect, or even an established fighter, and they're signed to someone like Oscar De La Hoya. Kind of like in the beginning, I believe Ryan Garcia was under, I believe that's Golden Boy Promotions and Oscar De La Hoya, if I'm not mistaken. But we know that Dana White does not like Oscar De La Hoya at all. We know they're like mortal enemies. So how is a fight going to get done, let's say, if a Ryan Garcia was still signed to someone like Oscar De La Hoya? And that's one of the biggest fights you can make. But for whatever reason, Dana White cannot put his ego to the side and make that fight happen. All because you have beef with the promoter. Like, I don't see, how that's really going to work out. And we know that Dana White has a good relationship with Abu Dhabi. And we know that Abu Dhabi and Riyadh season, they're coming together and they're making a bunch of boxing fights happen. They're actually reinvigorating the sport of boxing because at the present time, they're the ones that are making the biggest boxing matches happen. Whether it's in Saudi Arabia or whether it's in Abu Dhabi or whether it's in the US. They are making the biggest matches happening. And Dana White has a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. So maybe that's what Dana White is thinking, that, hey, I can work with Saudi Arabia. We can make these huge mega fights happen. And he sees how much money that Saudi Arabia has. And he sees the potential, because we got to keep in mind, the UFC just did their event, UFC 306 at the Sphere, and that was co-produced by Saudi Arabia. They actually had an investment in that fight, in that event. So much to the point to where they actually rebranded it UFC and Riyadh season. And I believe the Riyadh is what they're using for the boxing. So I can see that that's probably why Dana White wants to jump on this boxing train, because Dana White's been talking about boxing for years now. Probably like 10 years ago, Dana White's been talking about boxing. But the thing is, he's never done it. He's never said he was going to get into the boxing space. He's never said that it was actually happening. He just threw it out there. But I think now that he has that relationship with Abu Dhabi and with Saudi Arabia, he wants to get in on some of that money that they're making, which is really, really big money. Now, with the UFC event just happening at the Sphere, that was, to date, the biggest UFC card in the history of the company. So that broke the record for the highest gate all time. And they put so much money into that event, it's going to be hard to think that any other UFC fight moving forward can top that Sphere event. So that was kind of like a new high for the UFC. And Dana White said it was a one and done, never to be done again. And we all know when you get a new high, you're going to want to chase that high and keep getting bigger and better. But the thing is, imagine Dana White throwing that huge event at the Sphere, and then he has to go back to doing shows in New Jersey at the Prudential Center. Go to Anaheim, California at the Honda Center and do shows just like nothing ever happened at the Sphere. It's really not going to live up to what we just saw at the Sphere. Imagine Dana White just doing a show in New Jersey, doing the post-fight press conference, and then just goes back to his old rhetoric and just says, yeah, guys, you know, we broke the gate at the this gate was a record breaker. We got some fighters. We're going to give them a $50,000 bonus and things like that. Now, $50,000 is not enough. We are about to go into 2025 and you're still handing out $50,000 bonuses. Basically what I'm saying is that there's really no excitement anymore. And there needs to be like a rejuvenation, because really I feel like it is kind of stagnant at this point, and we do need something fresh to take us into the new year. Now, Dana White wants to get into boxing And he already has kind of done it in a way with this boxer from Ireland, Callum Walsh. Now, I don't know how much he had to do with his last fight, Walsh's last fight, but he was promoting it on all of the UFC channels. They did the face-off for the boxing event on the UFC page, and I believe they streamed the fight on UFC Fight Pass. Now, my question is, why is Dana White going to Ireland and looking for fighters? Is he just trying to like maybe find the next Conor McGregor or what? Because I don't know why he's going to Ireland and promoting those fights instead of trying to find new up-and-coming talent in the U.S. You know what I mean? And maybe he does want to find the next Conor McGregor. Maybe he gets flashbacks to that McGregor-Mayweather fight, and he just wants to see if he can like duplicate that in any way possible. And if that's the case, I don't think that's a great idea. Now, the UFC has a lot of great fighters already on the roster. And a few of them have already said that they want to go into boxing, kind of like what Conor McGregor did. Conor McGregor got the opportunity to go into boxing, make millions of dollars, over $100 million, and change their lives forever. And really don't even have to fight in the UFC anymore. So what happens if Dana White goes into boxing? Because keep in mind, like I was saying in one of my previous videos, boxers are making way more than UFC fighters. Some of these boxers, to get them to sign the contract, $10 million at minimum. At minimum, $10 million. And that's what these UFC fighters want. They just want a bigger slice of the pie. They just want a bigger payday. So what happens if Dana White goes into boxing and these UFC fighters, they want to start boxing too? I think it'll kind of create a conflict of interest, because imagine Dana White does his first boxing fight match, and the guys that he has fighting, let's say they're even making like $8 million, $10 million, $15 million. You don't think some of the UFC fighters are going to be like, hey, like I want to go do that too? Like, how are you going to go over to boxing and try to pay them more than what you're paying us? Like, I think it'll create a conflict of interest. And I think that some of these fighters, they're not going to be too happy about that when they got to watch their promoter go into a different sport, give those guys a bigger payday, and then when their next fight comes up, they're only signing for $500,000. They're only signing for $600,000. You see how that could create a conflict of interest? You don't think guys like Max Holloway wants to go get a big boxing fight? You don't think guys like Kamaru Usman's been saying he wants to go box? Ilia Topuria has been saying he wants to go box? Even Alex Pereira has been saying that he wants to go box. But do you think that they're going to go over into that space and make less money than those guys make? No way. It's not going to happen. So Dana White needs to be careful, and he needs to really know what he's getting himself into. And so the next thing that I want to get into is Jake Paul. Now, Jake Paul is probably one of those fighters that Dana White is talking about who he doesn't want to work with. Which is weird, because Jake Paul has came into the space and he's totally changed it up. Everybody at first said it was influencer boxing, influencer celebrity boxing. And then the more fights that he's gotten and the more guys that he's fought at a high level, he's actually changed the game, and he's given a few UFC fighters bigger paydays than they actually got when they were fighting in MMA. So, did Jake Paul have something to do with this, with Dana White going into boxing? Because if we remember correctly, when Francis Ngannou left the UFC and went to boxing, Dana White called it a gimmick. And he said, we do not do those gimmick fights here at the UFC. But now, for some reason, Dana White wants to go into boxing now. So I wonder if he still thinks that these are gimmick fights, or if he thinks that these are big, big money fights that people might actually want to see. So, did Jake Paul have anything to do with Dana White getting into boxing? Because Dana White used to always downplay Jake Paul. He used to always say that Jake Paul's fights weren't doing anything, weren't selling anything. And now he kind of wants to go back into that space. When I remember when there was a time that Jake Paul got into boxing, even before Abu Dhabi did, even before Saudi Arabia got involved with it, Jake Paul was fighting guys like, Nate Robinson, Ben Askren, Tyron Woodley. And then he kept moving up. And eventually he got into some bigger fights with Nate Diaz and some names like that. And I feel like, in a way, Jake Paul stole some of Conor McGregor's lightning. Because if I'm being honest, I think Conor McGregor, after he fought Floyd Mayweather, I thought he should have just stayed in boxing. That was supposed to be the evolution of Conor McGregor. Because when he was in there, that was the highest selling boxing fight of all time. I believe it did about 4 million buys. And so when he was actually in the ring with Floyd Mayweather, he didn't look halfway bad. Like, he actually kind of sort of looked like a boxer. And if I believe correctly, Conor McGregor was doing boxing before he was even doing MMA. He started off wanting to be a boxer. So I just don't know how Conor McGregor could kind of see the money that he made in boxing and how huge that was, and then come back to the UFC. But we probably know that had everything to do with Dana White and nothing to do with Conor McGregor, because Dana White likes to keep his fighters in these contracts, and he doesn't like them to do anything else. So he probably said, hey, Conor, I let you box, but you got to come back to the UFC. You're our biggest star. There's no way that we're going to lose you to boxing. But if I remember correctly, didn't Dana White always talk about wanting to start something like Zuffa Boxing? Wasn't that his boxing company? So I don't see how at that time he couldn't find a way to sign Conor McGregor to Zuffa, or whatever it's called, and have Conor McGregor continue to fight and continue to have these massive boxing matches. Now, we see what's happened to Conor McGregor ever since. He hasn't been the same. He got so rich, and once you're that rich, it's really hard to stay motivated to come back to MMA when we know the risk of injury is probably a little bit higher than boxing, because you just have to worry about more things, more weapons, more outcomes. You have to defend more. You have to box and you have to wrestle. And someone like Conor McGregor has always been just a striker. He's been a pure striker. And I don't know why at that time Dana White didn't say, hey, this is the perfect time for me to get into boxing. Why is it now all of a sudden once Jake Paul's in the space, once Abu Dhabi's in the space, once your biggest heavyweight star in Francis Ngannou got out of his contract to go get the biggest payday of his life and go box, and you hated on him, now you want to go into that boxing space. I just really don't get it, and it's not really making too much sense to me other than a big money grab. Now, if you think that Dana White is going to get into boxing and just start magically caring about his fighters, pay them fairly, give them health insurance, you're crazy. I just don't know what his plan is and what his vision is and how this is going to turn out if he can't even put his pride and his ego to the side to work with promoters that he says he doesn't like. That's going to come in the way of making a lot of fights that these people want to see. Jake Paul and Conor McGregor, that could potentially be a huge fight. If I'm being honest, should have happened a couple of years ago. But due to Dana White always clowning Jake Paul, always talking down on him, always saying that his fights weren't selling, always saying that they don't know what they're doing, it never happened. That's a fight that Jake Paul has been calling for and that Conor McGregor has been calling for. And now, if we're being honest, now it's probably too late. I'm not saying that Conor McGregor's not that big of a star that he once was, but we've seen his UFC career. He's gotten injured. He's taken a few losses. And it kind of seems like a couple years ago, that fight would have been way bigger than it is today. But will that fight ever happen due to Dana White's ego? Does Dana White want to co-promote a fight with Jake Paul? Even though we know that if they said, hey, Jake Paul, Conor McGregor, it's happening, we know how big that fight would be. Jake Paul even probably has good fighters that he is promoting that we can see some good fights. Jake Paul has some undefeated fighters on his roster. Jake Paul has Amanda Serrano on his roster, the women's champion. And these could potentially all be big, massive fights. But is Dana White gonna make them happen? Now, I know Dana White would probably be willing to work with Floyd Mayweather. If we were to see, or if someone were to say, hey, let's do Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor 2, I know Dana White would do that without hesitation because he's worked with Floyd in the past. He says he likes Floyd, and they did make a ton of money. But like I said, they probably should have done that after the first fight, not wait 6-7 years to try to do the rematch. And when you couldn't see the potential that it had when you first did it. I mean, I remember watching those press conferences between Floyd Mayweather and Conor McGregor. Those were some of the most iconic press conferences of all time. I would still go watch those press conferences and I would still probably get the same feeling and the same hype, because when you have two showmans like that, like, it just creates something that's special. But now, all of a sudden, Dana White wants to go try boxing. So I don't see how this is going to work out. Dana White says he doesn't do gimmick fights. Maybe this isn't going to be a gimmick fight that he wants to set up. But still, this is something that should have been done years ago. Now, maybe Dana White is going this route because he's starting to realize that some of his biggest stars are at the end of their careers. And he knows that maybe the UFC isn't going to be the same that it was while they were in their prime. We have guys like John Jones saying his next fight is going to be his last fight. And we have, obviously, Conor McGregor, who hasn't fought for a couple of years now, coming off an injury, was supposed to fight Michael Chandler. That fight got scheduled a couple of times, and it was canceled. We even have guys like Alex Pereira, who got on FaceTime with Jake Paul after Jake Paul beat Nate Diaz and said that he wants to fight with Pereira. And they even agreed to it. But we know Jake Paul said, unfortunately, unlike me, that's not up to Alex Pereira. That's up to his boss, Dana White. These guys can't get out of their contracts, and they can't go box. And maybe Dana is doing this because he knows that there is a ton of money to be had, and his biggest stars are out the door. So imagine if we saw John Jones in a boxing match. Now, we know that, I believe he's going to retire. But if the opportunity came for him to box and to make a substantial amount of money, I believe he would go do that in a heartbeat. Conor McGregor needs to go do something else. I think Conor McGregor's MMA career is done. I think it's over. He is one of my favorite fighters, but I just don't know what the point is anymore. He's too rich, and I don't think he wants to take that risk and, maybe tarnish his legacy if he loses again. Not to say that he's been losing a lot, but he just hasn't been active, and he did get injured. And even a guy like Alex Pereira, the UFC's biggest star right now, has said that he wants to fight Jake Paul. And Dana White has always been telling Jake Paul, hey, why don't you go fight somebody, your age? Fight somebody your height. Fight somebody that can actually fight. And I don't think we've really found anybody that, can stop Jake Paul. He's kind of unstoppable right now. I know he did have that one loss. But ever since then, and fighting these UFC guys, he's undefeated. So maybe Dana White wants to throw one of his guys in there and see if they could take Jake Paul out. But that's what I got for you. I probably left a bunch of stuff out, but I know that we'll have some more stuff to talk about soon. The further we get into this, the closer we get. If Dana White ever announces a fight, because right now it's still all speculation, and we'll see if he has any solid answers for us. But let me know what you guys think. Is Dana White trying to ruin boxing? And should he bring Conor McGregor along with him? Or do you think that there is a chance that he could get into boxing and make it work? So that's all I got for y'all. Let me know what y'all think, and I'll catch you on the next video. All right. Deuces.